Well, hello and welcome. Great to have you with us, although obviously you're not with us physically, wish you were. But let me introduce ourselves. My name is Michael Ots, and I am based in the middle of England. That's where I am right now, recording this. And I'm joined by Leah. Leah, where are you today?
So I am near Geneva, Switzerland, but actually on the French border. I am French. My name is Léa Köves, which is Hungarian, by the way, but French all the same.
Fantastic. So it's great. We're going to be taking you through for the next 40 minutes, and we'll be then fielding your questions later on. So as we go through, please be thinking of your questions. Please be thinking of how you'd like to respond to what we've said. But we're going to be thinking about the public proclamation of the gospel. And as we begin to think about that, it's really good to go back to scripture, back to the Bible, and think about why we do the public proclamation of the gospel at all. Why is this an important part of our evangelism? And the book of Acts, of course, is a great book to go back to. It shows us how the early church spread, and it shows us how that happened. What did the early Christians do? And I often think when Luke wrote the book of Acts, he had two things at least in mind. One was to show the fulfillment of Jesus' promise. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus had said to the disciples, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth." And of course, that's in many ways the contents page of the whole book of Acts. We see how the gospel went first from Jerusalem, and then by the end of the book to the ends of the world, so to the heart of the Roman Empire, to Rome itself. And so that's one reason. But I think another reason why Luke structured the book of Acts in the way that he did is he wanted to show how the world was evangelized. What did the apostles and the early Christians do? And we see three models or modes of evangelism taking place. We see the public proclamation of the gospel. We think of that in Acts 2 with Peter speaking on the day of Pentecost, or Paul in Acts 17 speaking in the Areopagus. The gospel being proclaimed publicly, one person to many in a variety of contexts. You also see small group evangelism. We see that perhaps most clearly in Ephesus, where Paul has discussions daily in the lecture hall of Tyrannus, the first Alpha course maybe, there in Ephesus, as people sat around and discussed. It wasn't just a proclamation, it was a dialogue, a discussion. There was persuasion, there was questioning, and so on. But there's also one-to-one evangelism taking place. Perhaps most famously, the example is Acts 8, isn't it? Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch sitting there in a chariot, talking about Isaiah the prophet, explaining the gospel. But of course, we also see it in chapters 9 and 10, when we see firstly Ananias speaking to Paul, and then Peter speaking to Cornelius. And what this shows us is that if the gospel is going to turn the world upside down, or your country upside down, or your locality upside down, we need to have all three, don't we? We need to have the public proclamation of the gospel, the small group investigation of the gospel that you might have in something like an evangelistic course, but also the one-to-one evangelization of individuals, the gossiping of the gospel from one person to another. And we particularly want to focus on the public side of that evangelism, the public proclamation of the gospel. I found in experience, often what people do is they pit one form of evangelism against another. So you have some people who say, the way we're going to reach the world is we'll do small group evangelism. We won't bother with that public stuff or that one-to-one stuff. And other people say, no, the way we're going to reach the world is by doing personal evangelism. We won't worry about the public stuff or the small group stuff. But actually what we need to realize is that we need all three together. We don't pit these things against each other as if there's a competition. We need to see that they are complementary and they work together. Public evangelism without personal evangelism will lack depth. But personal evangelism without public evangelism will lack breadth. We won't be able to reach so many people. And so we want to think about public evangelism. Now, particularly in the context of Europe, I would suggest that perhaps historically, we've been nervous about public evangelism, and perhaps for two reasons. One is that we are numerically quite small in many European countries today, aren't we, when it comes to the evangelical church? And when we are small, it feels like we can't do things publicly. We can't put on big events. Who's going to come? How are we going to do that? How are we going to fund it? How are we going to facilitate it? So it seems easier, perhaps, to focus our efforts on personal or small group evangelism when we feel like we're in the minority or we're small. The other, I think, objection to public evangelism in our context is that in an incredibly secular context, often evangelism is tough and it isn't necessarily immediately fruitful. So perhaps people have tried putting on a public evangelistic event, and when people don't immediately respond to the gospel, we can lose heart, we can give up. I've had people say to me things like, well, we tried that and it didn't work, so we won't try it again. And actually what we want to say right at the outset is that we do public evangelism, not just because it works, but because it's biblical. And that's the conviction that we need to have at the heart of what we're going to say today. Hopefully, you'll also see that it does work, and we can share stories and you can ask questions later about different examples that we've seen in different contexts where the public proclamation of the gospel has led to people coming to know Jesus, even in secularized and sometimes apathetic Europe. But we do it primarily because it is biblical, and we need to have the public evangelization, the personal evangelization, and the small group evangelization working side by side, hand in hand, not in competition with each other. Now, one of the things you notice when you look at the book of Acts is that actually public evangelism in the book of Acts hardly ever takes place in the context of a church, does it? So often when we think of the public evangelism, we're thinking about how we do it in a church building, and there is a scope for that. But actually in the book of Acts, we see it happening in all sorts of contexts. We see it happening primarily where people are. I work primarily with university students around Europe, speaking at mission weeks that have been organized in different contexts. And for me, it's a real joy to be able to proclaim the gospel in a real variety of creative contexts. Most of the time, it is not church buildings. There are barriers for many people to come into those kind of settings. Sometimes it will be a lecture hall in a university where people have come and been provided with a free lunch and then a short talk before a series of questions. In Serbia, they like to use coffee bars and cafes where people can come in and sit and drink together and then listen to a talk in a nice informal and warm context. I remember speaking in the Czech Republic in a little wine bar in the basement of a cellar, and it was a lovely environment to be able to proclaim the gospel. So when we're thinking of proclamation, don't just think of a proclamation that's happening in a church building or a religious context. Some of the best public articulation of the gospel happens in neutral environments. And you need to think, what are the environments that we can work in? Sometimes there'll be barriers. For instance, in a student context, many countries across Europe won't allow for public evangelism to happen on campus. So actually, you have to be creative. Where can we find near to the campus that we might be able to use? In Belarus, working with them, not only do they have barriers, but they also face the challenge of law because it's illegal to hold certain events like that we would want to do in a university mission. But they've been very creative, sometimes finding a Christian owner of a pizza restaurant that they can invite to allow them to speak and have events. So we need to think, where can we go, where people will come, where we can create a nice environment for them to hear the gospel. Another thing we see through the book of Acts is how all of the public articulation of the gospel is in response to stuff that is happening on the ground. It might be in Acts chapter 2, the incident where we see the disciples speaking in tongues, people asking questions about what it means, and then Peter standing up and explaining what is going on. Or in Acts 17, it's in response to a question that Paul is asked, what is this that you're talking about? And he uses a well-known idol that everyone perhaps would have walked by and seen as a way into speaking about the gospel. So we need to think really hard about the touch points that will intrigue people into which we can then proclaim the gospel. Again, in a student context, we work really hard at thinking of the titles that we're going to give to public talks. Most people, of course, are not going to come to a talk entitled, "What must I do to be saved?" Although that is a very important question. Most people, particularly I would suggest in Western Europe today, are not necessarily even asking God questions. The new atheism of the early 2000s has declined, but it doesn't mean people aren't asking questions. They're asking life questions. And how can we tap into some of those questions? Is there purpose to my pain? How can we have a harmony in a world of competing truth claims? How do I make sense of the future? Is there meaning to life? Try to think of the questions that tap into the real heart questions of your society, your culture. Try to think of a talk title that will intrigue people so they'll want to come. Not the kind of talk title where they know what you're going to say, but actually where they really want to know what you're going to say because they don't know the answer to those questions. Open questions, of course, are better than closed questions in that regard. But think carefully, what are the touch points, the bridges that we can build in our society into which we can proclaim the gospel? We also see in the book of Acts that the public proclamation of the gospel was persuasive. I find it very interesting that preaching is just one of the words that is used in the book of Acts to talk about the proclamation of the gospel. But it also talks about pleading, persuading, debating, urging. There are all sorts of words that are used to describe how the gospel is articulated. You see, preaching is not just presenting information, but it's doing it in a manner which is persuasive. And to be persuasive, we need to understand the worldview, the culture into which we're speaking, so that we can address the objections that people have, so that we can challenge the existing worldviews that people already obtain, and how we can present the gospel in a way that will be most clear and most persuasive. It needs to be persuasive. But also, it wants to be creative as well. Just because we're talking about the public proclamation of the gospel doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about a 40-minute monologue given in an empty room. There are all sorts of things that can supplement rather than supplant the proclamation of the gospel. One of the things that I love to do and learned from my mentor, Michael Green, was supplementing an evangelistic address with creative elements. It might be a piece of music, it might be a dramatic sketch, it might be a video, it might be a short testimony of someone who can illustrate the thing that we're seeking to speak about. So instead of a monologue for 40 minutes, we've got a creative magazine format for our presentation. That's particularly helpful in a culture where people are very visually geared. They're used to watching stuff, not just listening to stuff. And it's particularly helpful in a culture where people have short attention spans, because we can mix up our presentation and keep people with us. And also, when we use creativity in our public proclamation of the gospel, we can sometimes get under people's skin. C.S. Lewis, the Oxford professor, had a wonderful expression. He talked about, in using creativity, we can steal past the watchful dragons in people's minds. People have these dragons that are on the lookout for objective arguments, and they're ready to bash them down the moment they see some truth claim that is in competition with their own. But when we use creativity, we can steal past that and touch people's emotions in a way that perhaps just logical argument won't be able to. But also, and lastly, before I hand over to Leah, I would say this. The public proclamation wants to be done in the context of community and hospitality. And this is something that's really come home to me over the last 18 months. You see, one of the things that we have been able to do over the course of the pandemic has been to proclaim the gospel online, in a little way like we're doing just now. We're talking in this online digital context, and there's some wonderful good things about that. It was wonderful, for instance, that we had an ability to reach anyone, anywhere in the world, just about. And there were some fantastic opportunities that I had during that period to take part in online events on different platforms. And although I might be speaking for a Christian union in a university in one part of Europe, we had people engaging with us from all over the world, including sometimes my neighbours who were watching me in the room next door because they were in lockdown as well. But for all the positives of online communication, there are two things that I noticed that were really hard, not necessarily impossible, but really hard to do. One was to create a sense of community. When we engage with stuff online, often we feel like we're the only one doing it. We don't see the other people. It's just one voice speaking to another person. And also, it's really hard to create hospitality. Very different, isn't it? Watching a screen than as if we would wish we could do right now. Sit together, enjoy a drink together, have a meal together, and so on. And those two things, they're not impossible, are difficult online. But in person, those things, of course, are much easier. As we invite people into a context where they see other Christians, as they see the welcome and the warmth and the community that they could be part of. And as we offer hospitality, maybe by inviting them to a meal, into a lovely ambiance, perhaps with some live music, they all are really helpful when it comes to the public proclamation of the gospel. Now, some people object to this and they say, putting on a meal, all these things, they're just bribery, aren't they? They're a way of bribing people to come and hear the gospel. And so we won't bother doing that because all you need is the gospel. But actually, I don't think that is the case. See, think about it. One of the strong and clearest metaphors of the gospel, particularly in the Gospels in the New Testament, is this idea of an invitation to a party or a feast. Think of the parable of the great banquet. So what better way to illustrate the gospel, which is an invitation to a feast, by inviting people to a feast, by inviting people to enjoy a lovely meal together in the sense of warm community. You see, the context in which we proclaim the gospel will either underline or undermine what we're trying to communicate. Inviting people to a cold room where they sit in rows and listen to a lecture with no sense of community or opportunity to respond will undermine what you're trying to say. It feels cold. It's not adding anything. But invite people into a warm context where they feel loved and valued and noticed, where they feel that you've made extra efforts to make that a special occasion, and they will see something of the gospel embodied and lived out. It's no secret that evangelists sometimes repeat talks. And I have to say, one of the things I've noticed as an evangelist sometimes is that in some contexts, it just takes off. And in other contexts, it's really tough. And the difference often is this. In one context, there was community, there was hospitality, there was warmth, and there was welcome. And in the other, there wasn't. And it made all the difference to the proclamation of the gospel. So as we come out of the pandemic, as we think about the future, let's learn from the lessons of lockdown. Let's continue to use online communication in the way that it can be used, but also let's think about what we can do in person, and let's learn from what we lost as we now get the opportunity to do it again. Well, that's enough for me for now as we think about the biblical principles. I'm going to hand over to Leah to continue through on this. Thanks, Leah.
Thank you so much, Michael, for everything you have shared with us. And I think the question of how to foster community and hospitality is a really crucial one today, and especially online. And I will be happy to share in a few minutes what has been my own experience with the Imago Dei ministry. In thinking about the public articulation of the gospel, I would like to stress the importance of apologetics and zoom in on the apologetics ministry of Imago Dei. But before I expand more on that, let me share with you a little bit of my own testimony. When I started full-time ministry 2 years ago, I considered myself an itinerant evangelist. That was the title that I thought most fitted my calling and passion to share the gospel. That was also what my education and Christian experience had led me to. My hope was to take part in missions, events, and to partner with churches in order to publicly articulate the gospel. I wanted to do that both in France and in the French-speaking world. I had studied theology and apologetics in Oxford, so in the English language and in the Anglo-American world. And I strongly felt that what I had to do was to translate what I had learned into my own language and into my own culture. And I'm sure many of you know that it's not just a question of transposition of words. To that end, my thoughts were focused on two things: the message and the means. The message. How could I articulate the gospel in a way that is culturally relevant to my unchurched, religiously illiterate, ex-Catholic and New Age exploring culture? The means. How could I take part in the already existing structures that allow for a public proclamation of the gospel, such as talks in a cafe or events in churches and so on? So my thoughts were all focused on that, and then the pandemic happened. So I could definitely not be itinerant anymore because all traveling was banned and we were in lockdown. But to be honest, I didn't even know if I still could be an evangelist at all. The very structures where the public articulation of the gospel happened were closed, and new opportunities had to be created. Everything became digital. Michael referred to that very well. And again, it's not just a question of transposition, because you don't articulate the gospel in the same way to a crowd and to a webcam. So a lot of ministry had to be reinvented. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this frustration. Plus, the stress and surprise of the pandemic hit me hard. As the global church reflected on how to react and minister to people in the face of COVID, I was dealing with lockdown on my own and experiencing cabin fever. Some days, I had an unshakable confidence that the gospel was a unique message of hope to a world in shock. Other days, I was so shocked myself that I needed to relearn what the gospel even was. And I'm telling you all of this because this is an important lesson that I have learned from the last 2 years. If I am to bring the gospel to others, I really need to bring it to myself first. Let's ask ourselves the question, how convinced am I that the gospel truly is a message of salvation, healing, and restoration? How well do I know the power of this transforming message of hope? And especially when all the circumstances around me seem to fall apart. Perhaps if I undergo a season of suffering and hardships, those truths really need to be reasserted and reaffirmed. Plus, we can all fall into the trap of biting into the lie that we are gospel professionals and we forget to let ourselves be transformed and overwhelmed by God's gospel. And actually, in front of all of this, I have found that apologetics is a very helpful tool to regain confidence in the gospel. In the face of a pandemic, of personal trouble, or in the dangers of ministry, apologetics is a way to see the gospel re-articulated first to ourselves and to our hearts before we can articulate it to others. So this has been my own experience in the last couple of years as I focus on both the message of the gospel and the means to articulate it publicly. Now, what would you say is the value of apologetics? Let's explore this together as we think of how best to articulate the gospel publicly. Apologetics, as most of you might already know, means reasoned defense of the faith. It comes from a juridical context, from the kind of defense a lawyer could make in front of a jury and a judge in order to persuade them. The Greek word is apologia, and it is used by the Apostle Peter when he writes his first epistle to the early church, chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. Recognize in your hearts Christ as Lord, and always be ready to give a defense, apologia, before anyone who asks you of the hope which is in you. But do this with gentleness and respect. So apologetics is what the early church was doing when they gathered together and explored, reasoned, discussed, asked questions about the Holy Scriptures and the message of Jesus Christ. Apologetics, as I said before, is a very useful tool. But in my opinion, it has a twofold value. It is, one, for Christians to be reaffirmed in the hope they have in the gospel, and two, for non-Christians to rediscover the plausibility and coherence of the gospel. But how do we do apologetics in practice? Well, some of you may be familiar with the different types or approaches of apologetics. I like to put them into 4 different groups. Classical apologetics, in which we use logic and reason to prove the existence of God. Evidential apologetics, in which we use scientific and historical evidence for the plausibility of the gospel. Presuppositional apologetics, in which we ask our audience to accept the Bible and the Christian worldview as a basis to think about God. And cultural apologetics, in which we use elements of the culture to build bridges with the audience and lead them to the gospel. Of course, there are many books and resources, especially in the English language, to further develop each approach. And some theologians have added a couple of 3 more. Maybe some of you are already well-versed into some approach or another, and you may have your own personal favorite. But what I find useful is to see them as a toolbox, really, with different drawers containing each a set of tools. And depending on your talk, preaching, or conversation in your own articulation of the gospel, you can search for that particular tool that will fit your message. For example, if your talk is addressed to the scientific community and dealing with nature and the cosmos, the arguments of classical apologetics might be of help. All this will mean that we might need to regularly read apologetics books and articles in order to think afresh about an apologetic articulation of the gospel. First, for ourselves, and then it sink into our hearts, and then for the public. But how do we practically articulate such a reasoned defense of the gospel in the very public articulation of the gospel? Here are a few tips. Think for the crowd, talk to the crowd, discuss with the crowd. What do I mean by that? Well, first, think for the crowd. I remember a couple of weeks ago, I was in a church setting where I knew I had at least one non-Christian sitting next to me. And the person at the front was referring to the book of Daniel and his prophetic visions and linking that to what the persecuted Christians are living today in the church globally. And although what he was saying was very interesting, he constantly was assuming that people perfectly knew the book of Daniel and were very well aware of the prophetic dimensions of his visions. And he used rhetorical devices such as, I am sure you know that, and of course you are familiar with blah, blah, blah. And I could not help but thinking about my non-Christian neighbor who surely had no idea what he was referring to. When articulating the gospel publicly with the use of apologetics, we really need to make sure that we explain the terms and never assume the audience know what we are referring to. We have to think for our audience and do our best to make our content accessible. First, think for the crowd, then talk to the crowd. When articulating the gospel publicly with the use of apologetics, you may want to connect with the audience and evoke images and knowledge that they can relate to. You can use elements of the culture to build bridges with your audience, from pieces of advertisement to the latest book or series, or what's happening in the news. And then you can connect that to the message of the gospel. Think for the crowd, talk to the crowd, discuss with the crowd. When articulating the gospel publicly with the use of apologetics, and that's very true of the example that Michael was referring to earlier in the book of Acts, we need to make ourselves vulnerable to critique and objections and questions, and we need to allow for some Q&As. Sometimes the best answer is to acknowledge that we don't have the answer. But I really think that giving the opportunity for a conversation makes the gospel incarnated, and it serves the public articulation of the gospel. So to conclude on the value of apologetics, let's remember that it is a very useful tool. One, for Christians to be reaffirmed in the hope they have in the gospel. Two, for non-Christians to discover the plausibility and coherence of the gospel. But whatever your knowledge and experience of apologetics are, the beginning and the end of it all has to be to recognize in your hearts Christ as Lord, and always be ready to give a defense before anyone who asks you for the hope which is in you, and do this with gentleness and respect. I will now explain a little bit about the apologetics ministry of Imago Dei. For me, it has been the very context where I have sought to publicly articulate the gospel with the use of apologetics and through the pandemic. My hope really is that it encourages you and helps you discern for your own context some fresh ways to share the gospel. So Imago Dei is both a media and a network of people. It is designed for professionals who want to re-enchant their daily lives and reconsider what it means to be human and to live in the Imago Dei, the image of God. It is a media. The main platform is a website, and we are also present on social media such as Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram. But it is also a network of people, and we've been trying to foster community and hospitality, and especially through the pandemic, within the various spheres of society that we want to share the gospel to: the fashion industry, the business world, and top influencers in the arts, politics, sports, or gastronomy. With Imago Dei, we want to explore the profound issues of our culture in a way that is relevant to the French-speaking world and help that culture rediscover the beauty and power that is to be found in the good news of Jesus Christ. With this ministry, we use cultural apologetics because we address topics that we hope deeply resonate with people around us. Well-being at work, identity and sexuality, money and time management, spirituality. And we do that through articles, podcasts, videos, and when allowed with the current situation, in-person events. And we always try to link what we're sharing with things from the news and things from a culture so that people can really relate to what we are saying. But we also have developed online and in-person groups so that people within those spheres might gather and discuss together and be encouraged. But you may ask, why this format? And what does it all have to do with the public articulation of the gospel? Well, let me share with you a couple of figures that have helped us with Imago Dei to create that ministry. Today, internet is the main mode of access to information. Our worldviews and values are based on what we see and hear on social media. In the younger generation, 76% of the 18 to 24-year-olds get information on the internet and almost exclusively on their smartphone. Plus, our current generation is hungry for spirituality, but in the French-speaking world, faith is virtually absent from public debates. And I'm sure the same goes for some other European countries as well. Well, over the last 10 years in my own context, the number of people who say they believe in God has decreased by 7%. But the younger generations believe more than their elders, and we can see a couple of figures to demonstrate that. So with Imago Dei, we hope to create a platform where French speakers can have this online hospitality and community, although I agree with Michael, this is never the same than in person, and explore matters of faith using cultural elements that everyone can relate to. And so we want to share the gospel in terms that are culturally accurate and relevant on the internet. And so to conclude, as a young evangelist, when I was thinking hard about the message of the gospel and the means to share it, I have found that Imago Dei has created new structures for the public articulation of the gospel, such as online communities and podcasts and so on, and a culturally relevant way to share the gospel to the Francophone world with cultural apologetics. My prayer, as we all think about how to publicly articulate the gospel and to do it personally and sometimes more widely, is that we all feel strengthened and equipped by God to develop and or take part in such initiatives in everyone's contexts.
Brilliant. Leah, thank you so much. That is just incredibly helpful. I love that analogy of a toolbox when it comes to our apologetics. So often you find that people compete against each other as if this one tool is the one tool that's going to do the job for everyone, rather than saying, actually, let's pick the tool that's going to best do the job. And it's also fascinating as we talk about apologetics, because someone that's been a great example and mentor to me, John Lennox, actually refuses to use the word apologetics, partly because when we use the word apologetics, he says sometimes we think it's a discipline for some specialist, slightly academic, niche kind of part of the Christian church. He uses the expression persuasive evangelism, which is, of course, what apologetics is meant to be. It's giving the reason for the hope that we have, which is, of course, the gospel. But that sense that actually this is something we could all be part of. This isn't just for a specialist kind of corner of the Christian church. We can be utilizing these tools in our evangelism. And I love that thing that you said, that in the communication, we need to think for our audience, we need to communicate to them and then think with them. And I love that bit about the Q&A. My favorite bit of often an evangelistic event is the Q&A. It's that moment when you get to see how people are engaging in what you say. And often I find people think that someone should be able to give a 20-minute talk, but can they defend what they've just said in an open time of questions, which is what we're about to find out, isn't it? Because we're going to have
exactly.
Some questions now, and will magically appear live. And that's all that we're going to say, but we look forward to taking your questions in a minute. Thank you.
Thank you so much.